Counter-Narrative News, bringing you daily news today on Friday, the 27th of January 2023. In news from Palestine, in the occupied West Bank, the supremacist occupation forces have martyred 10 people in a violent daytime raid into Jenin camp. Those martyred include majority members of the Palestinian resistance from different resistance factions. Funerals have already started to be taking place. An elderly woman was killed, and also a younger man in a subsequent related protest was also shot and killed by the occupation forces of the Tel Aviv regime. This indicates a great escalation in the last year or so by Tel Aviv in its colonizing ongoing mission against the Palestinian people. Last year saw a escalation of deaths and injuries by the occupation state against the Palestinians, and today, already towards the end of January, we're seeing in the similar time frame of last year's first month that the number of Palestinians are nearly doubled this month killed than comparatively in the same period in 2022. The Palestinians still continue to develop and organize really impressive, wide-ranging, full-spectrum resistance against the colonizing mission of the regime. And in connected news as well, we're going to come to Ukraine and discuss some parallels between what's happening in Palestine and over there. But back to the Palestinians for a second. They are fighting on with incredible organization and strategy and tactics in a context where the regional and the global situation for the Palestinians is very much to the disadvantage of the cause of Palestinian resistance and the freedom fight there. They continue to fight on with many other neighboring Arab states that were used to be in some level of support to them, having drastically reduced their capacity to support the Palestinian cause, or in the case of, for example, Libya, to exist no longer as a supporting regional and allied state there. As we go forward, it remains to be seen how this is going to impact the Palestinian cause. The normalization process, which sees the Tel Aviv regime, quote-unquote, normalize relations with regional states and across Africa, is continuing. But the Palestinians clearly won't be defeated. And that being the case, the colonizing state has ultimately no option but to concretely deal with the reality of a people that will not be defeated and are scuppering fundamentally their white supremacist occupying, colonizing project. If we overlap the Palestinian cause with Ukraine by the use of a particular comment on social media on Twitter by a well-known English language speaking Chinese diplomatic corps, Chen Wenhua, argues that in his post, quote unquote, if you argue for dialogue in the Ukraine conflict, you're accused of being a Russian apologist. But if you argue that the Ukrainian government should be backed nearly limitlessly with military hardware, then somehow you are a champion of the Ukrainian cause. This is quite interesting, because what Chen is arguing here is that an occupied people who are seeing vicious attacks on the civilian infrastructure, usurping land and annexing it, occupying it, bombing it, etc., should be in dialogue with their occupiers, should be in dialogue with their aggressors. But perhaps this fits because the Chinese state's most important regional ally in the Middle East is the colonizing white supremacist regime of Tel Aviv. It exists existentially as a project to violently and viciously oppress the Palestinian people. And China's other main global ally, actually Beijing's main global ally, is Washington for decades now. But another ally, very close ally to China, is Russia. And Russia is doing to Ukraine very much what the Tel Aviv regime is doing to the Palestinians. Occupation, a colonial supremacist framework in so doing, targeting civilian infrastructure, stealing fertile land, stealing water, stealing factories and other means of production, And so there is a clear parallel here. So Moscow has responded to the agreement led by Germany and USA to provide combat tanks in the theater of the conflict in the defense of Ukraine. The response from the Moscow colonialist white supremacist regime is to express their anger and frustration by further targeting civilian infrastructure, particularly the provision of electricity to Ukrainian civilians in the middle of a bitterly cold winter. This collective punishment is the same framework applied onto Ukraine by Moscow. It's a very similar framework, although the annexing didn't take place, on NATO wars and also Western imperialist wars on places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. So it's really important for people to reflect that although, yes, Kiev and Ukraine is a cause célèbre for liberal Western imperialism, that's absolutely true, and there's deep problematics in that should be critiqued. On the other hand, Kiev and Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are faced with a capacity against an occupying, invading, and usurping and annexing enemy, which is 4, 5, 6 times greater capacity than their own. The Moscow regime has a much bigger human capacity, military and technological capacity. In just terms of hardware, it totally just mushrooms over the Ukrainian capacity by 4, 5, 6, 7 times over. It's really important for people to keep that in mind. And it's also important, arguably, to keep in mind that the leading Western powers are not there to save Ukraine from Russian aggression. They're there to, from the outset, to use Ukraine to entrap the Russians where they want them in this place in history. And Putin has walked into that trap with due to his arrogance and conceit, and dizzy with the success of his other supremacist military adventures, particularly in Syria and in Kazakhstan most recently. Counter-narrative news. Thanks for listeners for still engaging with us. Please encourage others to keep subscribing to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter at @counter_CNN, and we wish you the very best.